January 20th, 1953. The black limousine sat idling outside the White House portico, exhaust vapor rising in the frigid morning air. Inside the vehicle, two of the most powerful men in America sat in complete silence, their breath visible in the cold. The tension between them was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dwight Eisenhower, the president-elect, stared straight ahead. Harry Truman, the outgoing commander-in-chief, gazed out the window at the building he was about to leave forever. What neither man knew in that moment was that this 17-minute ride to the Capitol would mark the beginning of something unprecedented in American political history. For the next 8 years, Harry Truman would refuse to set foot in the White House. Not once. Not for state dinners, not for consultations, not even for ceremonial occasions. The 33rd President of the United States would effectively banish himself from the most important building in American politics. How does a friendship between two titans of American leadership collapse so completely? How does respect turn to hatred? And what could possibly drive a former president to boycott the White House for nearly a decade? The answers lie in a story of betrayal, wounded pride, and political calculations that went horribly wrong. This is the untold story of how two men who once admired each other became bitter enemies, and why one of them chose exile over forgiveness. To understand the depth of this estrangement, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to when Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower were not just allies but genuine friends. The year was 1945. Europe lay in ruins, but victory was finally within reach. Nazi Germany was crumbling, and the man who had orchestrated their defeat was becoming a household name across America. General Dwight David Eisenhower commanded more respect than perhaps any military leader since George Washington. He was the architect of D-Day, the supreme Allied commander, the man who had liberated Europe from fascist tyranny. Meanwhile, in Washington, Harry Truman was struggling with the weight of an office he never wanted. Franklin Roosevelt had died suddenly in April, thrusting the Missouri senator into the presidency at one of the most critical moments in world history. Truman felt overwhelmed. He told friends it was like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. He had been vice president for just 82 days. Roosevelt had barely included him in major decisions. Now suddenly he was making choices that would affect millions of lives. The contrast between these two men could not have been more dramatic. Eisenhower was a West Point graduate who had spent decades climbing the military hierarchy. He understood command structures, diplomatic protocol, and how to manage complex international relationships. His rise had been methodical, earned through competence and political savvy. At 54, he was at the absolute peak of his influence. Truman, on the other hand, was a former haberdasher who had failed in business multiple times before finding success in local politics. He had never attended college because his family could not afford it. His path to power had been unconventional, built on loyalty to political machines and a reputation for honesty in a corrupt system. At 60, he was learning the presidency on the job, but Truman possessed something that many politicians lack. He could recognize talent when he saw it, and he understood the value of surrounding himself with capable people. When he looked at Eisenhower, he saw exactly the kind of leader America needed. More than that, he saw someone who could unite the country in ways that he himself never could. Eisenhower was politically valuable precisely because he seemed to transcend politics. Democrats wanted him. Republicans courted him relentlessly. Nobody knew which party he belonged to, and that mystery made him incredibly appealing to voters across the political spectrum. He was the ultimate outsider, untainted by partisan battles or controversial positions. Truman began cultivating their relationship almost immediately. He invited Eisenhower to the White House regularly. He sought his advice on military matters and foreign policy. He made sure Eisenhower felt valued and respected. The general responded positively to this attention. Their meetings were warm and productive. They developed genuine mutual respect. In July 1947, Truman made a proposal that stunned everyone who heard it. He told Eisenhower that if the general wanted to run for president in 1948, Truman would be honored to serve as his vice president. Think about that for a moment. A sitting president offered to step aside and become second in command to a man who had never held elected office. It was an extraordinary gesture that revealed how highly Truman valued Eisenhower's leadership potential. Truman genuinely believed that Eisenhower could be a transformational president. He was willing to sacrifice his own political ambitions to help make that happen. Eisenhower politely declined. He insisted he had no interest in politics whatsoever. He was a soldier, not a politician. He wanted to serve his country in uniform, not in elected office. But Truman did not give up easily. He continued to offer Eisenhower important positions and responsibilities. When George Marshall stepped down as the Army Chief of Staff, Truman appointed Eisenhower to replace him. This was one of the most prestigious positions in the American military. Eisenhower would oversee the demobilization of millions of troops and help shape the post-war military structure. It was exactly the kind of role that would enhance his reputation and keep him in the public eye. Their correspondence during this period reveals a genuine friendship. Eisenhower addressed Truman as Mr. President with obvious respect. Truman called him Ike and treated him like a trusted advisor. They exchanged views on Soviet intentions, European reconstruction, and military strategy. There was no hint of the catastrophic breakdown that was coming. In 1950, when Truman needed someone to command the newly formed NATO forces in Europe, he again turned to Eisenhower. The general agreed without hesitation. He understood the importance of the Atlantic Alliance and wanted to help build it into an effective deterrent against Soviet expansion. Eisenhower moved to Paris and threw himself into the NATO assignment with characteristic dedication. He worked to integrate the military forces of 12 different nations. He dealt with complex political sensitivities and competing national interests. He built relationships with European leaders and helped establish NATO as a credible military organization. Throughout this period, Truman and Eisenhower maintained regular contact. Truman kept the general informed about major policy decisions. Eisenhower provided detailed assessments of European conditions and Soviet capabilities. Their relationship remained strong and mutually beneficial. But beneath the surface, political pressures were building that would eventually tear their friendship apart. Republican leaders were growing increasingly desperate to find a candidate who could defeat the Democrats in 1952. Harry Truman was unpopular due to the Korean War and various scandals in his administration. The Republicans needed someone with broad appeal who could win back the White House. Eisenhower remained their most attractive option. His popularity transcended party lines. Veterans loved him. Suburban voters trusted him. Even many Democrats respected him. Republican power brokers began intensifying their recruitment efforts. At the same time, Eisenhower was beginning to reconsider his position on political involvement. He was watching the Cold War intensify and growing concerned about American foreign policy direction. He worried that isolationist Republicans might win control of the party and abandon the international commitments he believed were essential for American security. The pressure campaign reached its peak in February 1952. A massive rally at Madison Square Garden drew 40,000 people chanting Eisenhower's name. The demonstration was broadcast on television, and Eisenhower watched it from his headquarters near Paris. According to witnesses, he was visibly moved by the outpouring of support. That rally changed everything. Eisenhower realized that the American people genuinely wanted him to run for president. He began to see his potential candidacy not as personal ambition, but as patriotic duty. If the country needed his leadership, how could he refuse? In June 1952, Eisenhower returned to the United States and announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination. He went to his hometown of Abilene, Kansas, to make the announcement. The decision would transform American politics and destroy his friendship with Harry Truman forever. The race was on, and nothing would ever be the same. Be the same. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was facing its own dilemma. Truman had decided not to seek re-election. He was exhausted, politically damaged by the Korean conflict, and ready to return to Missouri. The party nominated Adlai Stevenson, the intellectual governor of Illinois who possessed impressive credentials but lacked the common touch that voters seemed to crave. Initially, Truman remained relatively quiet about the campaign. He respected Stevenson's capabilities and believed the governor could win on merit alone. But as the weeks passed and Republican attacks on his administration intensified, Truman's anger began to boil over. The GOP was systematically dismantling his legacy, questioning his competence, and suggesting his administration had been riddled with communist sympathizers. What made these attacks particularly painful was Eisenhower's silence. Here was a man Truman had promoted, supported, and treated as a friend. Yet when Republicans attacked the very policies that Eisenhower had helped implement, the general said nothing in defense. When they questioned Truman's foreign policy judgment, Eisenhower offered no support for the man who had trusted him with NATO command. The breaking point came in October 1952 in Wisconsin. Senator Joseph McCarthy had been terrorizing government officials for 2 years with his reckless accusations of communist infiltration. His tactics were despicable, his evidence non-existent, but his political influence was undeniable. McCarthy thrived on fear and paranoia, destroying careers with innuendo and half-truths. One of his primary targets was George Marshall, Truman's former Secretary of State and the architect of the Marshall Plan. Marshall was also Eisenhower's mentor, the man who had elevated him over dozens of more senior generals during World War II. When the army needed someone to command European operations in 1942, Marshall had recommended Eisenhower despite his relative inexperience. This recommendation had launched Eisenhower's career. Marshall himself had desperately wanted that European command, had spent his entire professional life preparing for exactly that opportunity. But when President Roosevelt decided Marshall was too valuable in Washington, the general accepted that decision without complaint and threw his support behind Eisenhower instead. It was an act of selfless patriotism that Eisenhower never forgot. Marshall had sacrificed his own ambitions to give Eisenhower the chance of a lifetime. Everything Eisenhower had accomplished stemmed from that moment of generosity. Yet McCarthy was now calling Marshall a traitor. He accused the general of deliberately sabotaging American interests in China. He suggested Marshall was part of a communist conspiracy. He used the most vicious language imaginable to describe one of America's greatest public servants. Eisenhower was scheduled to campaign in Milwaukee, McCarthy's home state, with the senator sitting prominently on stage beside him. His speechwriters had prepared remarks that included a strong defense of Marshall. The passage praised Marshall as a dedicated patriot and rejected McCarthy's accusations in clear terms. But on the afternoon before the speech, Wisconsin Republican leaders cornered Eisenhower. The governor was there, along with state party officials and local power brokers. They were panicking about the political implications of defending Marshall in McCarthy's stronghold. Wisconsin was a crucial swing state, and McCarthy remained enormously popular there. Attacking him on his home turf could cost them the state's electoral votes. They pressured Eisenhower relentlessly to remove the Marshall defense from his speech. They painted apocalyptic scenarios of electoral disaster if he proceeded with the original text. They argued that antagonizing McCarthy would hand the election to the Democrats. Eisenhower, inexperienced in political campaigns and uncertain about electoral calculations, made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He agreed to delete the 74 words defending Marshall. That evening, he delivered the speech without mentioning Marshall at all. He stood on stage with McCarthy, praised the senator's anti-communist goals, and even shook hands with him for photographers. The political press immediately noticed the deletion. Campaign staffers had already distributed the original speech text to reporters, so when Eisenhower failed to deliver the Marshall defense, it became front-page news. Headlines across the country highlighted the omission. Editorial writers questioned whether Eisenhower had the moral courage necessary for presidential leadership. The public reaction was devastating. Many Republicans who had supported Eisenhower felt betrayed by what they saw as a craven political calculation. Veterans groups expressed disappointment that their hero would abandon his mentor under pressure. Even conservative newspapers that endorsed Eisenhower questioned his decision. For Truman, this was the final straw. Marshall represented everything he admired in public service. The general had served his country with complete dedication for 4 decades. He had been Chief of Staff during World War II, Secretary of State during the early Cold War, and the driving force behind European reconstruction. He was universally respected by allies and enemies alike. To see Eisenhower abandon Marshall under pressure from a demagogue like McCarthy was, in Truman's view, unforgivable moral cowardice. The man he had once considered presidential material had revealed himself to be just another politician, willing to sacrifice principle for votes. Truman's public response was swift and brutal. He told reporters he never thought the Republican candidate would stoop so low, but that was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Truman launched a sustained attack on Eisenhower that went far beyond normal campaign rhetoric. He accused Eisenhower of moral blindness. He said the general had displayed cowardice under political pressure. He mocked Eisenhower's lack of government experience and suggested he was naive about how democracy actually functioned. At campaign rallies across the country, Truman painted Eisenhower as a military man who understood only orders and obedience, not the complex negotiations required for civilian leadership. These attacks were personal and cutting. Truman suggested Eisenhower was being manipulated by conservative Republicans who would use him as a figurehead while dismantling New Deal programs. He predicted the general would struggle with congressional relations because senators and representatives would not follow orders like soldiers did. The crowds responded enthusiastically to these attacks. Democratic audiences loved seeing their former president take the fight directly to the Republican nominee. But the attacks had a devastating effect on Eisenhower personally. According to his speechwriter Emmett John Hughes, the mere mention of Truman's name would bring flashes of anger to the candidate's face. Eisenhower felt deeply wounded by what he saw as unfair personal attacks from someone he had considered a friend. He had served his country honourably for 40 years, commanded millions of troops, and helped defeat Nazi Germany. Now the president was calling him ignorant and morally deficient in front of crowds of cheering Democrats. The bitterness deepened with each passing day of the campaign. Every attack from Truman made Eisenhower angrier. Every criticism widened the gulf between them. By election day, their friendship was completely dead. On November 4th, 1952, Eisenhower won the presidency in a landslide victory. He carried 39 states and received over 400 electoral votes. It was a crushing defeat for the Democratic Party that validated Republican arguments about the need for change after 20 years of Democratic control. But victory did not heal the personal wounds. If anything, it made them worse. Eisenhower now had the power to exclude Truman from official Washington, and he intended to use it. The stage was set for an unprecedented 8-year estrangement that would deprive both men of valuable counsel and damage the institution of the presidency itself. The transition period that followed would be cold, formal, and deliberately minimal. Two proud men who had once shared mutual respect were now locked in a bitter feud that neither seemed willing or able to resolve. The weeks following the election were a masterclass in political ice. The constitutional requirement for a transition meeting could not be avoided, but both men approached it with all the enthusiasm of condemned prisoners walking to their execution. November the 18th, 1952. The date was circled on both their calendars like a dental appointment neither wanted to keep. Eisenhower arrived at the White House that morning with the demeanour of a man fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. He had told his aides he dreaded the meeting, that he saw no value in prolonged discussions with someone who had spent months questioning his fitness for office. Truman, meanwhile, had prepared extensively. He genuinely believed that presidential transitions required serious attention to detail, regardless of personal animosity. The meeting took place in the Oval Office, that sacred space where both men would make decisions affecting millions of lives. Truman attempted to provide comprehensive briefings on the major issues facing the incoming administration. He discussed the ongoing Korean conflict, relations with European allies, domestic economic challenges, and the complex web of congressional relationships that would determine legislative success or failure. Eisenhower sat politely and listened, but his body language conveyed profound disinterest. He took few notes, asked minimal questions, and gave every impression that he considered the entire exercise a waste of time. Later, in his private diary, he would write that the meeting added little to his knowledge and did not affect his planning for the new administration. For Truman, this dismissive attitude was salt in an already deep wound. Here he was, trying to fulfill his constitutional responsibilities and share hard-earned wisdom about the presidency, and his successor was treating him like an irrelevant has-been. The man who had occupied this office for nearly 8 years, who had made the decision to use atomic weapons and had guided America through the early Cold War, was being brushed aside like yesterday's newspaper. After the official briefing concluded, Truman made what would prove to be his final gesture of friendship. He invited Eisenhower to return for an informal lunch before Christmas. It would be a chance to continue their discussions in a more relaxed setting, perhaps to begin healing some of the wounds from the campaign. The invitation was genuine, an olive branch extended despite months of bitter attacks. Eisenhower declined immediately. No explanation, no counter-proposal, no suggestion that they might meet at a different time or place. Just a flat rejection that made clear he had no interest in spending any more time with Truman than absolutely necessary. That rejection stung more than all the campaign attacks combined. Truman realized in that moment that their friendship was not merely damaged, but completely dead. The man he had once offered to serve as vice president would not even share a meal with him. The remaining weeks until inauguration passed in almost complete silence between the two camps. Most presidential transitions involve regular contact between outgoing and incoming teams, staff. Members coordinate extensively on everything from personnel decisions to policy briefings. This transition was different. Communication was minimal, formal, and conducted through intermediaries whenever possible. Eisenhower's team made it clear they wanted to chart their own course without input from the Truman administration. They viewed any advice or assistance as potentially contaminating their fresh start. Better to learn through experience than to rely on the guidance of people they considered failures. This attitude infuriated Truman's staff, many of whom had devoted years to public service and possessed invaluable expertise. They watched helplessly as their successors ignored institutional knowledge that had been accumulated through hard experience. It was like watching new drivers refuse to look at roadmaps because they wanted to find their own way. Meanwhile, the symbolic preparations for Inauguration Day were creating their own tensions. Every detail became a potential source of conflict. Eisenhower decided to wear a Homburg hat instead of the traditional silk top hat worn by previous presidents at their inaugurations. It was a small thing, but it felt like another deliberate rejection of established customs and traditions. The morning of January 20th arrived grey and cold. Washington was experiencing one of its harsher winters, with temperatures hovering around 30 degrees and a bitter wind cutting through the capital. The weather seemed to match the mood between the two principals. Truman had spent his final morning in the White House saying goodbye to staff members who had served him faithfully. Some had been with him since his early days as president. Others had joined during the challenging years of the Korean War. All had witnessed history being made in these rooms, and many were emotional about leaving. The Eisenhowers arrived at the White House promptly at the appointed time, but they remained in their limousine. Protocol dictated that the incoming First Family should come inside for coffee with their predecessors before departing for the capital. It was a tradition that helped humanize the transfer of power, a moment of shared recognition that they were all participants in something larger than partisan politics. But the Eisenhowers refused to leave their vehicle. They sat in the back seat of their limousine waiting for the Trumans to come out to them. It was a deliberate breach of protocol that photographers captured for posterity. The images showed two cars parked outside the White House portico, one containing the outgoing president waiting to be picked up, the other containing his successor refusing to observe basic courtesies. Truman finally emerged from the White House and walked to the limousine. He climbed into the back seat next to Eisenhower, and they began the 17-minute journey that would complete the transfer of power. Neither man looked at the other during the initial minutes of the drive. The silence was broken only once during the entire trip. Eisenhower asked who had ordered his son John, who was serving in Korea, to return to the United States for the inauguration. Truman replied that he had given the order personally. He believed it was appropriate for a son to witness his father being sworn in as president, regardless of military duties. Eisenhower thanked him quietly. It was the only moment of human connection during the entire transition period. Two fathers acknowledging that family relationships transcended political differences, even when those differences had become bitter and personal. The limousine arrived at the Capitol building where thousands of spectators had gathered despite the cold weather. Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office while Truman watched from the platform. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient custom, another peaceful transfer of power in the world's oldest democracy. But there was nothing peaceful about the relationship between the two men at the center of the ceremony. Eisenhower delivered his inaugural address without once acknowledging Truman's presence. He spoke about America's responsibilities in the world, about the challenges facing the nation, about his vision for the future. He mentioned the need for unity and cooperation, but his words rang hollow given the obvious tension on the platform. After the ceremony concluded, the traditional inaugural parade began its 10-mile journey down Pennsylvania Avenue. Marching bands played patriotic songs, floats depicted scenes from American history, and military units displayed their precision and pride. The new president waved to crowds while the former president made his way to Union Station. Truman and Bess boarded a train that would take them back to Missouri. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, and Truman waved from the rear platform as the train pulled away from Washington. He was going home after 8 years in the White House, but he was also beginning an exile that would last far longer than anyone imagined. The train journey to independence gave Truman time to reflect on what had just transpired. He had entered the presidency as an accidental leader, thrust into office by Roosevelt's death. He was leaving as a man whose legacy was under systematic attack by his successor's party. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the Truman Doctrine, all the achievements he considered most important were being questioned or criticized. But what hurt most was the personal betrayal. He had genuinely admired Eisenhower and had believed their friendship was built on mutual respect and shared values. To discover that Eisenhower was willing to abandon those values for political convenience had been devastating. To then endure months of personal attacks during the campaign had been infuriating, and now to be treated with such obvious contempt during the transition felt like the final insult. As the train rolled through the American heartland, Truman made a decision that would define the next 8 years of his life. He would not go back to Washington as long as Eisenhower occupied the White House. If the new president wanted to ignore his experience and expertise, if he wanted to treat him like a pariah, then so be it. Truman would stay in Missouri and let history judge which of them had served the country better. It was a decision born of wounded pride and genuine principle. Truman believed that Eisenhower had revealed himself to be a man without moral courage, someone who would sacrifice anything for political advantage. Such a person did not deserve his cooperation or assistance, regardless of the tradition surrounding former presidents. The train pulled into Independence late that evening. Truman stepped onto the platform in his hometown, a private citizen for the first time in 8 years. The crowd that greeted him was warm and supportive, but much smaller than the ones he had addressed as president. The transition from global leader to Missouri retiree was jarring and immediate. In the weeks that followed, Truman began establishing the routines that would define his post-presidency. He took daily walks through Independence, often stopping to chat with neighbors and shopkeepers. He worked on his memoirs, trying to shape the historical record while events were still fresh in his memory. He answered correspondence from supporters around the world who wanted to maintain contact with the former president. But conspicuously absent from his activities was any involvement with official Washington. When other former presidents might have been consulted on major decisions, Truman remained in Missouri. When ceremonial occasions called for the presence of past presidents, his name was not on guest lists. The man who had led America through some of its most challenging years was being systematically excluded from public life. This exclusion was not accidental. Eisenhower had made a deliberate decision to cut all ties with his predecessor. No invitations were extended, no consultations were sought, no gestures of respect were offered. It was as if the Truman presidency had never happened, as if 8 years of American history could be erased through deliberate neglect. The pattern established itself quickly and thoroughly. State dinners proceeded without Truman's presence. Foreign leaders visited Washington without meeting the former president, who had dealt with many of them during the early Cold War. Congressional ceremonies honoring various achievements excluded the man who had often been instrumental in those accomplishments. Most painfully for Truman, the annual events that traditionally brought together current and former presidents were conducted without him. Memorial Day observances, 4th of July celebrations, occasions that should have been above partisan politics, were now closed to him because of one man's unwillingness to share the same space. The exile had begun, and it would prove far more enduring than either man could have imagined. What started as wounded pride and political calculation would harden into something approaching permanent estrangement. The most exclusive club in America, the fraternity of former presidents, had expelled one of its members through the sheer force of personal animosity. Animosity! The months that followed revealed the true scope of Eisenhower's determination to erase Truman from Washington's consciousness. This wasn't merely about avoiding awkward encounters or preventing political embarrassment. This was systematic exclusion executed with military precision. When Winston Churchill visited Washington in early 1953, protocol would normally have dictated that all living former presidents be invited to meet with the legendary British leader. Churchill had worked closely with Truman throughout the early Cold War. They had developed genuine mutual respect during their collaborations on NATO formation and European reconstruction. Yet when Churchill's itinerary was finalised, Truman's name was nowhere to be found. The slight was particularly painful because Churchill himself had inquired about Truman's absence. The British Prime Minister understood the value of continuity in international relationships. He knew that Truman possessed insights about Soviet intentions and European politics that could prove valuable. But Eisenhower's staff politely deflected these inquiries, suggesting that the schedule was already too crowded for additional meetings. Similar patterns emerged with every significant visitor to the White House. French leaders who had negotiated directly with Truman during the Marshall Plan discussions were not encouraged to seek his counsel. German officials who had worked with him during the Berlin blockade crisis found no opportunities to reconnect. Even leaders from smaller nations who developed personal relationships with Truman during his presidency discovered that those connections were now irrelevant. The message was unmistakable. In Eisenhower's Washington, the Truman years were ancient history. Anyone seeking to maintain relationships with the former president would find no encouragement from the current administration. The institutional memory that Truman represented was being deliberately discarded. This isolation extended to domestic ceremonies as well. When legislation was signed that built upon programs Truman had initiated, he was not invited to witness the occasions. When medals were awarded to veterans of conflicts he had overseen, his presence was not requested. When anniversaries of major decisions from his presidency were commemorated, he remained in Missouri. The exclusion was so complete that it began affecting Truman's relationship with the Democratic Party itself. Congressional Democrats who might have sought his advice on strategy found it politically risky to maintain visible connections with someone the current president clearly despised. Party fundraising events that might have benefited from his presence were organized without him. Even more troubling for Truman was the way his policy achievements were being systematically undermined or ignored. The Marshall Plan, which had rebuilt Western Europe and prevented Soviet expansion, was being administered by people who seemed to misunderstand its original purposes. NATO, which he had helped create as a bulwark against communist aggression, was being managed by officials who lacked his insights into European sensitivities. The Korean conflict, which had defined much of his second term, was being handled by people who had criticized his approach without fully understanding the constraints he had faced. Every decision Eisenhower made regarding Korea felt like an implicit criticism of Truman's leadership, even when the new president was essentially continuing the same policies. Truman watched these developments from independence with growing frustration. He possessed knowledge that could have prevented mistakes and insights that could have improved outcomes. But that expertise was being ignored because of personal animosity and political calculation. The country was being deprived of his experience because two proud men could not overcome their differences. The personal cost of this exclusion was enormous for both men, though in different ways. Truman felt genuinely hurt by the rejection of everything he had accomplished. He had devoted 8 years of his life to public service, under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. He had made decisions about atomic weapons, confronted Stalin, rebuilt Europe, and fought a war in Asia. Yet his successor was treating him as if none of that experience mattered. For Eisenhower, the cost was more subtle but equally real. He was depriving himself of counsel from someone who understood the presidency in ways that no advisor could match. Truman had faced congressional opposition, managed international crises, and dealt with the daily pressures of global leadership. That institutional knowledge was irreplaceable, yet Eisenhower was rejecting it entirely because of personal feelings. The irony was that both men were facing similar challenges. Eisenhower was discovering that congressional Republicans were just as difficult to manage as congressional Democrats had been for Truman. He was learning that foreign leaders had their own agendas that did not always align with American interests. He was finding that the presidency was far more complex than commanding an army, exactly as Truman had predicted during the campaign. But instead of seeking guidance from the one person who could have helped him navigate these challenges, Eisenhower relied entirely on his own judgment and the advice of people who had never held ultimate responsibility for national decisions. It was like refusing to consult a map while driving through unfamiliar territory, simply because you disliked the person who had drawn it. Meanwhile, in independence, Truman was establishing new routines that filled his days, but could not entirely satisfy his need to remain engaged with public affairs. He worked on his memoirs with passionate intensity, determined to ensure that history would record his version of events. He maintained extensive correspondence with supporters around the world who shared his perspectives on current developments. Most importantly, he began developing the Harry S. Truman Library, which would become his primary legacy project. The library would house his presidential papers and serve as a research centre for scholars studying his administration. It would also include a museum that would educate the public about his presidency and the crucial decisions he had made. But even this project became a source of additional hurt when Eisenhower failed to participate in its dedication. Presidential libraries are typically supported by both parties as important contributions to American historical preservation. When a former president dedicates such a facility, the current president usually participates as a gesture of respect for the institution of the presidency itself. Eisenhower sent only a formal telegram that was read during the ceremony. The message was polite but impersonal, offering generic congratulations without any acknowledgement of Truman's specific contributions to American history. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic communication that might be sent to any minor official opening a new building. Truman was devastated by this final insult. He had hoped that the library dedication might provide an opportunity for reconciliation, or at least for a gesture of respect that transcended personal differences. Instead, he received confirmation that Eisenhower's animosity was permanent and absolute. The telegram became a symbol of everything wrong with their relationship. Here was an occasion that should have celebrated American democratic traditions and the peaceful transfer of power between leaders. Instead, it highlighted the petty personal grievances that were preventing two great men from working together for the national good. As the months turned into years, the estrangement deepened rather than healing. Time, which might have been expected to soften hard feelings and provide perspective on past conflicts, instead seemed to harden both men's positions. Every month that passed without contact made future reconciliation more difficult. Every slight, real or imagined, added another layer of resentment. Truman's friends and advisers began urging him to make the first move toward reconciliation. They argued that his refusal to visit Washington was hurting his own historical reputation and depriving the country of his wisdom. They suggested that swallowing his pride might serve the greater good, even if Eisenhower had behaved badly. But Truman remained adamant. He had not started this fight, and he would not end it by capitulating to someone who had shown such disrespect for the office they had both held. If Eisenhower wanted to exclude him from Washington, then Washington could do without Harry Truman. He had survived the presidency. He would survive this exile as well. The country, meanwhile, was changing in ways that both men might have addressed more effectively if they had been able to work together. The Cold War was intensifying, with new challenges emerging in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Domestic issues around civil rights and economic policy required the kind of experienced leadership that comes from understanding how government actually functions. Instead of benefiting from the combined wisdom of two presidents who had successfully navigated previous crises, America was being led by an administration that refused to acknowledge that such wisdom existed. It was a tragic waste of human resources at a time when the nation faced unprecedented challenges both at home and abroad. The pattern seemed destined to continue indefinitely. Two stubborn men, both convinced of their own righteousness, had created a situation that served no one's interests. Neither seemed capable of making the gesture that would begin healing the wounds they had inflicted on each other and on the institution of the presidency itself. But history has a way of forcing reconciliation even when human nature resists it. Events were approaching that would test both men's commitment to their mutual animosity and ultimately provide the catalyst for change that neither could initiate on his own. The question was whether they would recognize that opportunity when it finally arrived, or whether their pride would prove stronger than their patriotism, autism. The answer would come from an unexpected source, a man whose name most Americans had never heard but whose conscience would prove stronger than the political calculations that surrounded him. Bryce Harlow was not a household name, but he understood power better than most people in Washington. He had served in government since the 1940s, working his way up through various administrative positions until he became one of Eisenhower's most trusted aides. Harlow possessed something rare in political circles, the ability to see beyond immediate partisan interest to longer-term consequences. He watched the estrangement between Eisenhower and Truman with growing concern, not because he particularly liked either man, but because he understood what their feud was doing to American institutions. The presidency, Harlow believed, was bigger than any individual who occupied it. The office required continuity, institutional memory, and respect for those who had carried its burdens before. When former presidents were excluded from public life, the country lost access to irreplaceable experience and wisdom. When sitting, presidents refused to acknowledge their predecessors, they diminished the office itself. But raising this issue with Eisenhower was extraordinarily dangerous. Everyone in the White House knew about the president's feelings regarding Truman. Staff members had learned never to mention the former president's name in Eisenhower's presence. Bringing up the subject of reconciliation could easily result in immediate dismissal from the administration. Harlow spent months considering whether to act. He consulted with other senior staff members, hoping to build support for an intervention. Chief of Staff Sherman Adams refused to get involved, suggesting that Harlow had lost his mind to even consider such a thing. Jerry Persons, Thomas Stevens, and James Haggerty all declined to help, recognizing the political suicide that challenging Eisenhower on this issue would represent. Only Ann Whitman, Eisenhower's personal secretary, offered any assistance. She agreed to keep the Oval Office door open during Harlow's meeting with the president in case he needed to make a quick exit. It was a small gesture, but it represented the only support Harlow could find for his risky intervention. In May 1958, Harlow finally decided to act. He had concluded that his duty to the country outweighed his concern for his own career. Someone needed to tell Eisenhower that his treatment of Truman was damaging the presidency itself, and apparently he was the only person willing to do it. The conversation took place in the Oval Office on a spring morning when Eisenhower seemed to be in a reasonably good mood. Harlow approached the subject carefully, emphasizing his respect for the president while expressing concern about the broader implications of the current situation. He began by acknowledging that Eisenhower had every right to feel angry about Truman's campaign attacks. Those attacks had been personal and unfair, and any reasonable person would have been hurt by them. But Harlow argued that the public estrangement between a sitting president and his predecessor was sending the wrong message to the American people and to the world. Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and emotional. The wounds from the 1952 campaign were still raw, still capable of generating genuine anger. He recounted Truman's attacks in detail, describing how they had questioned his intelligence, his integrity, and his fitness for office. After 40 years of honorable military service, to be called ignorant and morally blind by a sitting president had been devastating. But Harlow persisted, making an argument that went beyond personal feelings to institutional consequences. He suggested that regardless of what had happened between them personally, Eisenhower and Truman both had responsibilities that transcended their individual grievances. The American people expected their leaders to put the national interest above personal animosity. More importantly, Harlow argued that extending an invitation to Truman would actually benefit Eisenhower himself. It would demonstrate magnanimity and statesmanship. It would show that the president was big enough to rise above past conflicts for the good of the country. And it would help heal wounds that were damaging both men's historical reputations. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Eisenhower expressing his anger, while Harlow patiently made the case for reconciliation. Finally, after much discussion and obvious internal struggle, Eisenhower agreed to send invitations to Truman. It was not a complete capitulation, but it represented the first crack in the wall of mutual hostility that had separated the two men for over 5 years. The first invitation went out on May 20th, 1958. It invited Truman to attend the dedication of the Korean War Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery on May 30th. The timing was significant, only 11 days' notice for a major ceremonial event. Whether this short notice was intentional or accidental became a source of immediate controversy. It took the assassination of a young president to finally bring these two proud men together in the same room. When John Kennedy was murdered in Dallas in November 1963, both Eisenhower and Truman attended the funeral. They rode together from the cathedral to Arlington Cemetery, sitting in uncomfortable silence broken only by shared grief. Afterward, for the first time since that cold January morning in 1953, Eisenhower accepted Truman's invitation for coffee. They sat in Blair House, two old men talking quietly about loss and legacy. The hatred had finally exhausted itself, though the friendship never truly returned. Harry Truman's 8-year exile from the White House stands as a reminder that even the most powerful people are still human, still capable of letting wounded pride override their better judgment. Sometimes the cost of being right is higher than anyone should have to pay.